Hi, this is Paul. Let's dive into Jordan's Exodus seminar. And it's a massive work, and 4 are out there. Now, they recorded 16, and they're all 2 hours plus. So it's a lot of commentary. And basically, the rule for when I do commentary is I get about 3 minutes of my commentary for every 1 minute of video. That's sort of the norm. So the first one has a big discussion about the midwives. I don't know if I'm going to take a lot of time with the midwives because I don't know if I have that much to offer, but there's a few things that they don't treat. Now, it's absolutely impossible to treat everything in the text. So I want to make a few comments about that before we get too far.
All right, so having said that and introduced everybody, we're going to start with the text, and as I said, I'll read it, and I'll make comments when they strike me, and we'll have everyone jump in, and away we'll go. So, Exodus 1. Now, these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already.
And sometimes, now he's reading out of the King James Bible, and every now and then, it's not a bad choice, but it's a part of what happened is that the English language has changed since this was written. So the New Revised Standards has the number of people. The NIV uses 70. If you're using Bible software like Logos software comes with a little Bible that the editors of the software put together, and part of the advantage of that is it's sort of like the King James in that you sort of have a word-for-word translation. Now, there are weaknesses to that because the meaning it really isn't just in the words, and you can just stack them up sort of like blocks. It's not really how language works. But it is handy because you can turn on the language underneath if you want to see what word is used. Jordan is reading the King James, and it says 70 souls. The NRSV says 70 people. The word underneath is a nephesh. And a nephesh in Hebrew is sort of a whole person. You learn in Genesis that when God breathes into the man that he makes out of the dust of the earth, he becomes a living nephesh. It's a body and soul together. Now, I don't even like saying it that way because that sort of introduces the dualism. But so there were 70 nephesh that came out of Egypt.
And Joseph died.
Or came into Egypt.
And all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied.
Now, that point right there, I'm surprised nobody stopped. But again, I don't know how they recorded this. Because you could talk for 6 hours and then just take 2 hours of recordings from it. You know, you've got people working cameras there. You've got editors. You've got a lot going on. This is a major project, actually, to undertake. But what's key here in these early verses is you pick up where Genesis leaves off. And if you read the beginning of Genesis, this is the command to be fruitful and multiply and fulfill the earth. And what is happening, and this is a very big pattern in the book of Genesis. I've just been reading Genesis with my men's Bible study. And one of the interesting things in Genesis is that often the patriarchs will do something wrong. They will put God's plan in danger. Abraham will say of Sarah, his wife, she's my sister. Isaac will do similarly. Jacob will do all sorts of schemy things. And each time they do something which is sometimes even immoral or something unbecoming a patriarch, God would, and someone would move against them, God would actually take this adversity and turn it to their gain. This is a significant pattern within the book of Genesis, and this is exactly the same pattern that the book of Exodus begins with, because What should have happened was that, well, put under this heavy bondage, Israel should have sort of shrunk and been dissolute. But just like the pattern in Genesis, the pattern in Exodus is that no, even against their adversaries, God is taking this adversity and turning it to the gain of his own mission. And what's amazing, just like in Genesis, the people in Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Judah, they're all sort of oblivious to the hand of God behind the scenes. And now here at the beginning of Genesis, even after they have forgotten the name of God and no longer relate to him, they've been in bondage for so long, God still moves beneath the scenes to accomplish his mission and his purpose.
And waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. So Jacob and the Israelites are presented as sojourners into Egypt. So they're foreigners, they're strangers in a strange land, you might say, and they came in under the guidance and patrimony of Jacob, who had a good relationship with the power structure in Egypt, but he dies and the generation.
Joseph, but it's the touching scene at the end of Genesis when Pharaoh meets Jacob. It's really a rather touching scene.
After him dies, and relationships between the Israelites and the Egyptians become strained.
Is commenting while you read okay?
Comment at any point you want.
Okay,
Yep.
so just for all of your edification, in Jewish life, if there are 10 best-known verses in the entire Torah, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, is one of the 10. It summarizes the human condition of ingratitude perfectly. Joseph had saved the Egyptians from starvation, and the next Pharaoh doesn't even know his name.
So he's forgotten the debts.
He has forgotten the debts. He has entirely.
Now, again, one of the things that you'll see at the heart of this series is the quest for wisdom. And sort of what they do with wisdom is you take this story and you, in some ways, deconstruct it for its relevance realization. And you say, people should remember their debts. And this is pretty typical of what Jordan does in terms of taking the Bible and looking for wisdom, looking for patterns, and say, okay, once we have the patterns. A number of comments in the video that I released this morning. Today is Monday. I'm going to try and put some videos in the can because I won't be making videos. I'll probably be making videos for the membership channel, but I probably won't be making these commentary videos over the next little while. And I will take some equipment so that I can do it, but that's some people say, well, there is, in a sense, a lot of where the conversation is turning right now with respect to Christianity or religious belief make a resurgence. Enchantment is a word that's sort of hovering around a lot of these conversations, and a lot of the complaining about Jordan by well-enchanted church people is that he doesn't believe in God. And I think it's a lot more complex than that when it gets to the question of Jordan and God. But one of the deistic patterns that emerges in the Enlightenment is itself turning things into patterns, and these patterns sort of then become sort of natural laws, or they can become laws that are sort of hosted sociologically or psychologically, or laws that are nested by our evolutionary development, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this business of the quest for wisdom is very much what this series is about.
But this is, as I say, the human condition. We have forgotten our debts in America to Washington, Madison, Jefferson. This
and again, whereas in my conversation, with Greg Hurwitz, he said, "Well, it isn't really political," and in some senses it isn't. But again, often preachers would say, use this point to say, we in the church should remember our debts and obligations. The transformation here is sort of in the public sphere. We as a nation should remember our debts and obligations. Now you might argue that, well, Egypt is a nation, but that's a real Egypt wasn't a nation like Germany is a nation. The whole concept of a nation has changed pretty dramatically. It is, in fact, some sort of political body, but the locus of this conversation with respect to, okay, let's take this biblical wisdom. Now, this is in many ways sort of a hearkening back to, let's say, pre-cultural revolution, pre-late 1960s America, where you had sort of Protestant hegemony in the nation. And I said before that what happens in the Enlightenment is sort of the fabric of authority and intelligibility and, let's say, a common communal reading and understanding of the Bible. In the Christian Reformed Church, we're talking about confessionality. That fabric begins to come undone. And the modernist fundamentalist fight is over. Modernists would say you can't trust the Bible for history, meaning, of course, modern history. You can't trust the Bible for science and history, sort of how the physical world works, but you can trust the Bible for morality and ethics. And then what happens then with the rise of the new atheist into the 1980s and 1990s, then, especially with 9/11, people then turn and say, and you can't trust the Bible for ethics either, even though, for the most part, if you look at my video that I just made with respect to Sam Harris, for the most part, all of that ethics is simply assumed Christian, Western Christian ethics that have been popularized throughout the world through the colonial period.
And there arose a new generation in America who knew not Madison. Mm-hmm. That could be a perfect verse.
Right. Okay. Now,
and you didn't go on there. Again, you see the little cuts, which is absolutely fine. You have to sort of deal with that. But, you know, to Dennis Prager's point, and of course this is a deeply Jewish point, you read it in the book of Deuteronomy, it's the job of the previous generation to instruct the other generation, and those things are passed on in story. And in fact, it isn't so much in America a forgetting, it's a reposturing to say, well, didn't George Washington own slaves? Look at Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. Therefore, they were bad. It's like this super low resolution, bad, good, and off you go. But yeah, not a word about the fact that right there, it's really a key verse right at the beginning of Exodus that tips you off to the fact that this is the same story of Genesis. This is the same God with the same mission that began with Genesis, be fruitful and multiply and fulfill the earth. That God is still at work, but now there's a new crisis. And so again, it's great storytelling.
now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. There's an accusation of a crime before it's committed, right? These people are just a threat and a plague, and so we can't trust them, and that's part of this ingratitude as well, and a breakdown of trust, and that definitely sets the stage for conflict to break down.
Well, we should be a little fair to Egypt that everyone who is in power looks around at their potential enemies. I mean, the United States looks at Russia and China and says, well, we got to keep our eye on them. Look at China's industrial capacity. I just saw a thing recently about how many ships China could build if it wanted to compared to how many warships the United States could build. And of course, part of what changed the world in the Second World War is the United States could build more warships than anyone else and just basically cover the Pacific with warships. And the Japanese, after the American industrial might got going, Japan didn't have a chance. But yeah, so Egypt's looking around and saying, we have a problem here. It's also a bit of the fact that God's chosen people are always a distinct people. the children of Israel haven't assimilated into Egypt. They are seen as separate. So, and so then the question that Egypt wants to do is, how can we assimilate these people? And of course the plan is, we'll kill all the boy babies, and then all the women and children, they remain, and so we simply assimilate them. And in fact, you find this throughout the Old Testament, that the various empires of the world, this vision is very much taken up in the book of Daniel. Daniel very much shows that these empires of the world, and Egypt is sort of the prototype, but Egypt, and then Babylon, and Persia, and Assyria, and the Greeks, and the Romans, these imperial nations gobble up the little kingdoms, and the kingdoms are sort of little families and little people of the world. And the one group of people that doesn't seem to be able to be assimilated, even to this day in some respects, are the children of Abraham. They stand out. They don't assimilate. They maintain themselves throughout the generations as a people apart.
Down of trust. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. So the response to the hypothetical crimes of the Israelites was to enslave them. And one of the things we should notice very early on in this is that the book of Exodus regards that move of enslavement as fundamentally wrong. It's like an axiomatic precondition of the narrative itself. And modern people, I suppose, don't find that surprising.
And again, if you look at the visions, so the book of Daniel is very interesting. You have these first 6 books where it's all Daniel and his friends, and it's down, and Daniel's this hero in the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. Then you get into chapter 7, and the tone of the book changes pretty dramatically. Now Daniel is having these dreams and visions, and Daniel is in some ways sort of a new Joseph. And he's troubled by these dreams and visions. And if you look at Daniel 7, you have these beasts of the sea, and they come out. Well, those are the empires. And in many ways, Exodus is just part. I mean, the Bible is a phenomenal book because the themes get carried on. Jordan Peterson, of course, in the first one have this rainbow of hyperlinks, but the themes get carried on. And so this is what empires do. Empires assimilate. Empires colonize. Empire, and Jonathan Peugeot is about to explain quite nicely the way this works.
Because we all believe that slavery is wrong, but it isn't obvious that most of the countries and nations that...
But again, the issue here in Exodus isn't slavery, because slavery was just sort of like the internal combustion engine. It's just a fact of life. This is how the world worked.
In the past, practiced slavery, regarded it as wrong. And so this invisible ethic that already permeates the narrative has a revolutionary aspect in that sense. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians...
And there again, the point I made earlier, the first point in the book, right there. If you attack God's people will win. I should find this because I always think about it when I see this dynamic. Oh, they've changed the box. I'm going to have to take a picture of the box that I have and of the card I have, because it's this fun game that you play, and I play it with my kids, and we play it and we get it. It's this little dice game, but they have this one card which is you're only making it stronger. And part of the point of the story of the Bible is that if you fight against God, you're going to lose. If you persecute God's people, you're only making them stronger.
Made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor.
If you don't have access to biblical Hebrew or tools to sort of take it apart, another thing that you can do is obviously read people who know it well. Robert Alter, a Hebrew scholar at Berkeley for many years, has a wonderful book of his own translation of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Talks about the book of Exodus here. The narrative is organized around three thematic defined spaces: Egypt, the place of bondage; the wilderness, a liminal space where freedom will be realized and new obligations incurred, where a tense struggle between leader and people will play out as part of the initiatory experience of nationhood; and the promised destination of Exodus from Egypt, the land that remains beyond the horizon of this book. Egypt is associated with water, almost everything there linked with its central waterway, the Nile, where baby Moses is saved from drowning, where the 10 plagues begin, where the barrier of water must be crossed to the effect to escape of Israelites. With that very water, they were then drowning the pursuing Egyptian hosts that had sought to drown the Israelite infant boys. So Robert Alter translates these verses. And as they abused them, they did multiply, and so did they spread. And they came to loathe the Israelites. And the Egyptians put the Israelites to work at crushing labor. And they made their lives bitter with hard work, with mortar and bricks and every work in the field. All their crushing work that they performed. And he'll emphasize that crushing. The Hebrew is an adverbial form derived from a root that means to break into pieces, to pulverize. Work, work, work. Following the prevalent stylistic practice of Hebrew narrative, the writer underscores its main topic, the harshness of slavery, by repeating the central thematic key word. Indeed, the Hebrew literally says their crushing work that they worked. In English, that cognate accusative form sounds awkward, except for a limited number of idioms, such as sing a song. The king said, and now we get to the midwives.
That reminds me, that part of what happened under the Nazis with work camps and in the gulags as well, right? This idea that you identify your enemies and then you sentence them to hard labor in your service against their will. And so you see this idea echoed very early in this story, and something that's definitely echoed through the 20th century.
Yeah.
So,
but there's really this idea that what the Pharaoh is doing is wants to reduce Israel to potential for Egypt, basically. And you'll see it later when he wants to get rid of the men. He just wants women. And so in this image, and it repeats even the story of Abraham, how the Pharaoh wants to take his wife. It's about taking the potential of another people and try to subjugate it to yourself.
So it's a reflection of instrumental usage.
That's right.
Yeah, and so, you can see that in people's proclivity.
Well, the people are reduced and they are no longer people. They are just tools and pawns. They are dehumanized. Remember that what came into Egypt were 70 nephesh, these living, breathing image bearers of God, and now they're just instrumentalized.
Proclivity to use one another interpersonally, because when you're talking to someone, you can decide a priori what you want from them, and then you can bend your words and your interactions so that you exploit what they have to offer for your purposes.
This is Jordan Peterson's definition of lying. This goes all the way back to 2017 and 2018, and lying pastors. I made a video about Jordan talking about lying. Why doesn't he go to church? Because the pastors lie. And I think he had something very much similar in mind of what pastors are doing to people beneath their control, instrumentalize them. I've told this story before. One of my best early friends here in Sacramento, he lived right down the street from me, and I was playing with my son out in front of the house, and he drove by. He says, "Does your son want to play soccer?" I didn't even ask my son. I said, "Sure." And I got to know him, and then, we'd gotten to know each other a little bit, and then he got around to asking me what I did. I said, "I'm a pastor." He said, "Pastors are kingdom builders. They build their own kingdoms." That's exactly what Jordan Peterson is talking about here.
Or you can engage in honest dialogue where the purpose is mutual enrichment, and that what would you call it, instrumental end doesn't dominate. Yeah. So,
and you can experience it like at least the mystical fathers, they talk about Egypt also as representing your own passions. That is, you become a slave to something, and then you become an instrument of that.
Okay, now notice the subtle shift between, remember Dennis Prager talked about Americans have forgot their founding fathers. That's sort of on the political level. Now, often what the church does, and you see Jonathan just did it there implicitly, now it went down to the personal. Now we're talking about the human being. Now this switch from an individual to a city, you see that in Plato's Republic. It's something that commonly happens. And the Bible actually does this in a number of places too. If you want to deal with a big thing, you deal with a person. And in many ways, Israel is a person, but Israel is also a nation. And so you just keep switching back and forth. And you'll find that here, but often again in church, the emphasis is on the individual down here. But now often in this series, and I think in the Genesis series, more often it was the individual, because you had Genesis was, of course, the early history, the first 11 chapters, and then the story of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Judah.
Thing, right? So it's like I don't know, anything that you have, like you like to eat, and then you're there, and at first, when eating knows you, like when your passion knows you, then you're fine. It's in the right order. Things are in the right order. But when
notice now suddenly there's a very spiritual amount. Did you see what he just did with language? When eating knows you, now suddenly we're living in a world of spirits. We're living in a world of, you'd better watch that eating spirit.
Your passion or desires or whatever behavior you have forgets you, then you become an instrument of it. Right. Like think of a drug addict, where everything they do serves this tyrant, and so all their potential you get reduced to a potential for behavior,
right.
And that can be
so
seen
that's for a subordinate
too.
deity in some sense, and that might be your stomach or
Seeing Jordan sort of pulled it back out again there.
Your lust, and so that's very interesting too, because the word Israel means we who struggle with God. And so what that would mean psychologically is that
It's interesting how he keeps saying we who struggle with God. It's not inaccurate or unfair, but just he who struggles with God, meaning, the man Israel. But now we who struggle, it's patterned out, it's made collective, communal. And again, this is sort of in the shift from Genesis to the individual, Exodus to the communal.
That which should be at the highest place, which is the part of you that's struggling with the highest, is then subordinated instrumentally to something that should be lower in the ethical hierarchy. And that could be your own inner tyranny, and it could be someone else's instrumental will, or some state's instrumental will. And that's portrayed as fundamentally inappropriate in this text.
And you'll see, and
again, Jordan's focus here on, this is wisdom for the state. And in that sense, again, even though the reading isn't just sort of the culture war issues sort of pop up every now and then in it, but this is very much for Jordan sort of a neo, is this Christian nationalism? Well, in many ways it is. They're looking for wisdom in terms of how to run a society, how to run a nation, how do we do this? Well, the answers are here in the book, in the story. And of course, these values, these patterns, these spirits have been what have governed the formation of the nations that we know in the West, even in terms of their ongoing reformation. Reformation, for example, abolishing slavery, and how, for example, comparing how, let's say, the United States dealt with those it conquered in the Second World War differently than, let's say, Germany or Japan.
It's imaged as this idea of making bricks, and that's a reference to Babel as well. It's like this idea of wanting to be higher than God.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Noting again the link, the bricks between Babel and now Egypt, and the fruitful and multiply. That's a good point.
Or wanting to replace God, and so we make civilization. That's what bricks are. We make civilization, and then we think that civilization replaces the highest ideal.
I don't know if Dennis would agree with this, but I know some rabbis believe that Israel was judged when they were divided because Solomon was becoming almost a second pharaoh with a corvée of the people and forced labor and so on, and he was bringing a kind of slavery in at the end and getting too much. Israel's called to be an anti-Egypt, and he's
constantly
becoming...
And again, what I talked about in terms of empire. Now, it's very interesting in Daniel because, of course, the Son of Man figure that arises in Daniel 7, the Son of Man figure then is an alternative empire to the empires of the world. And this, of course, will very much set up Augustine's vision of the city of God.
Too much.
For your interest, there are two tyrannies. This is the overriding theme, I believe, of the whole Torah. External tyranny to pharaohs, internal tyranny to your lusts, etc.
So now Prager sort of tries to bring these two together, the big and then the individual.
Yourself. And the Torah actually has a law, which many Jews still observe, where you count every day between Passover and Pentecost, Shavuot. Shavuot is the 7 weeks after. You do this for 7 weeks. Every day you actually count with a blessing using God's name. This is the 7th day of the 49 days and so on. Why? You can't have freedom from Pharaoh if you don't have freedom from you. So Sinai is the second freedom. Now you.
And this is a nice way of sort of bringing these two things together. I really enjoyed Dennis Prager during this series. He was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed him.
You have to be liberated from external tyranny, and now the liberation from internal tyranny is the Ten Commandments.
Well, that begs the question too, then, doesn't it? That I think the Bible, in some sense, is aggregated to answer, which is, well, is there something other than various forms of tyranny? And if there is an alternative to tyranny, and maybe that's freedom, whatever that is, or maybe it's holy freedom, then that's qualitatively different than mere subjugation to one tyranny among others. My students used to ask me when I was teaching my Maps of Meaning course, how do you know that what you're teaching isn't just another ideology, which is another tyranny in some sense? And that's an extremely deep question.
It is, and it's a good question, because here's the irony. I mean, Bob Dylan, you got to serve somebody. The question is, what in fact are you serving? And if, again, when I talked about, Sam Harris, well, the world is just chaotic and we impose structure on it. Well, if that's the case, rationality is of absolutely no good to you. So one of the ways that when I look at these individuals, you have to ask, is being good, is being neutral, or is being evil? If being itself is evil, there's no point to any of this. If being itself is neutral, there's very little point to very much, because, John Vervaeke again continues to make the point that all of what we do with respect to all of this admonition and such has deep within it the implication that there is a logos, there's a rationality within the created order that we can engage with productively. And so the question of the students, I'm not surprised that students in our culture would ask this, because again, in many ways, the prevailing religion of our culture I call progressive liberationism, that we always have to get rid of anything above us. And so that anything above me must be a tyranny. Oh, no. C.S. Lewis, in a beautiful thing, writes about the specific pleasure of the inferior, the dog before his master, the child before the good parent, the faithful employee before the boss. And in fact, in the Bible, you find again and again with Joseph, with Daniel, you have these people who are slaves. Joseph is a slave, Daniel is a slave, but they're the best servants that these unworthy emperors have, because they serve the emperor, because they serve the one that is above the emperor. And this is exactly what Peter and Paul talk about in the New Testament. And everybody sort of kicks against it. Slaves, obey your master as to the Lord. They're tying into the Old Testament here by noting that Joseph was a slave. He was the best slave, and he was treated poorly again and again. And eventually he was elevated to the highest place. And so you see in the book of Daniel, very much the same structure emerges. But the best, the servant of the Most High God will be the best servant even of unworthy potentates, unless and until those potentates violate the rules of the high God. You see this in the New Testament when Peter is called in and says, we must serve the Lord, not you. And so they give the Sanhedrin proper respect, but they say, my service of you is limited. I will be the best servant you can ever imagine, until and unless you really violate the one that we must all serve, including you. And this is how Israel puts up the story. It's not completely unlike the nations, because of course Pharaoh is a god, but there's this whole realm of other gods, and so it's a little, with polytheistic structures, it's a little bit more complicated. But they understood a hierarchy.
And the postmodern types would say, well, it's all ideology, it's all tyranny. You just pick whichever tyranny you want to abide by, but it's all a matter of power or something like that. There's no transcendent orientation that pops you outside of the realm of, well, of tyranny in some real sense. So, and the biblical narrative insists that that is not the case. So it's a pretty dismal view, that it's just a choice among tyrannies.
But to pick up Dennis's great point of the two
And that's again the point of, is being good, is being neutral, or is being evil? If being is merely neutral, then it's all arbitrary. But if being is good, there is in fact a structure, and there is in fact a God.
Is that Lord Acton, the famous saying, all power tends to corrupt. Power oppresses the weak. That's the obvious one, and it happens here. But it corrupts the powerful.
Right.
And that's
Right.
what happens to Pharaoh.
Yeah, and there is such a thing as corruption, right? So that's an absolute reality, the corruption that power tends to produce. Of course, that's partly why the Pharaoh's heart is hardened as well. And yeah, it's a very germane observation that slavery corrupts the slaver as much as the slave, or perhaps you could say perhaps even more, right? Because it incites within the slaver something like a Luciferian presumption, and it entices him for instrumental reasons into denying the divinity of someone else, and then acting in the manner of someone who denies divinity per se, right? Absolutely pernicious and corrosive. So, and the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which...
Okay, now they're going to talk about the midwives. I think I'm going to stop this video here. They treat the midwives to a great degree. That one came out in the clips. I don't really have a lot to add to the midwife conversation, but I do have some things to add to some of the smaller points, and maybe that will... I mean, if there's a portion that I think is fairly well treated, I just won't bother giving it my time unless I think there's a point I really want to make with respect to it. But some of the other points that they simply didn't have a chance to go into further, or some things I'd like to point out about what's happening in this series. Press the button there so you can see me while I use my hands. What's happening in this series, I'll do that. So maybe I'll pause this here. Again, we'll see how much endurance I have for this. There are 16 episodes. They're 2 hours each. I never really completed the Genesis series. Part of it because this was all quite new to me. But yeah, there's a lot. And it's like everything else. There are certain episodes of this that I thought were really good, and certain points made in episodes that I thought were really good. So I don't know that I'll have the stamina to do a commentary on every last minute of the 32 plus hours of this series, but it's all really good. I really enjoyed it. So okay, that's enough for this. So I'll stop here before the midwives. We'll see if I treat the midwives at all, but then there's some other points that arise that I really want to talk about.